the Bible. It's undoubtedly the greatest work of spiritual genius. But is it literary genius? I want to argue in this course that not only is the Bible the Word of God, but it's also amazing, remarkable, if not the greatest work of literary genius ever. We call it the Bible, which literally means the book. I've often thought it shouldn't be called the Bible, but rather it should be called the library, because it's really a collection of books spanning 1,500 years. It's a lot of time and a lot of authors here and a lot of great literature. We're going to look at the great stories of the Bible, the great poetry of the Bible, and ask ourselves, is this good? I don't think you're going to be disappointed. My students are often worried that if we read the Bible as literature, somehow we'll hurt the Bible. But in all my years of teaching, I have yet to have a student feel that the Bible didn't come out even better. And we began to really recognize that it is the most remarkable book in the world. So let's get started and let's talk about the Bible as literature. But before we do, I want to ask you some questions. And I would love for you to be honest with yourself. So here's my first question. What are your favorite stories in the world? Maybe even if you have a pen and paper beside you, write them down. What are some of your favorite movies, favorite films? Something you've seen 50 times and you'll probably see 50 times more and not even be tired of it. What are your favorite books? I don't often read books more than once, but the ones I love, I do. What are some of those books? What are some of the stories you just love? What are those favorite films and books and stories? And then I would love for you to ask this question. What are some of your favorite Bible stories? What stories do you love most? When you were a kid, these were the stories you loved to hear about. Maybe it was the story of David and Goliath, Jonah and the great fish, Joseph, who goes from being the favorite son of a rich nomad to a slave, to a prisoner, to second in command of an empire. Maybe it's the story of Jesus. What is your favorite story or stories in the Bible? Write those down too, if you could. And then I want to ask this question. Here's the hardest question of all. Looking at your favorite films, your favorite books, your favorite stories, your favorite Bible stories, what do they have in common? Maybe some of yours are love stories, and you love love stories. Maybe you love to see those stories where good triumphs over evil, where the weak or seemingly weak overcome the strong. Maybe you just love to see outcasts who suddenly show everyone that there's more to them than people realize. What do your stories have in common? Because I bet they do. I bet your favorite films, your favorite books, your favorite Bible stories have some things in common. Pay attention to that. And then ask maybe the hardest question of all. Why? Why do all the stories that you love, that I love, have something in common? This isn't a new idea. This is actually something that has been around for a long time. People have begun to notice for a long time that our stories tend to have something in common. So for example, my favorite stories as a child, my favorite Bible stories, were the story of Gideon, where you have somebody who's the least in the least tribe who triumphs over a mighty army. I've always loved the story of Jericho, where they march around the city 7 times and the walls come down for some reason. I love the story of Joseph, Why? What does that say about me? I think it says a lot about me. Well, this is an idea that has been with us enough time that the great psychologist, the great father of behavioral science, Carl Jung, began to notice that all of our great mythic stories are the same story. I don't know if you've ever felt like this before. That maybe our greatest stories all feel like they have something in common. And he began to notice that our fairy tales and our folk stories and our great myths all have the same basic storyline. And he thought he had found something amazing. He thought he had found essentially the thing that links all of humanity. He called it the collective unconscious. If you want to think of it as the collective dream of all humanity. But one of his main proteges, a man by the name of Joseph Campbell, had the audacity to try to see if he could map out this one story, this single story that all of our mythic stories seem to have in common. And he put it out in the 1940s in a book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And he began to talk about how our Native American stories and our Greek myths and our Norse myths and our African myths, all of our stories, our fairy tales, our folk stories, they're all telling one story. And he actually began to map them out. Now I'm going to be using a word a lot. I'm going to be using the word myth in this class, or mythology. And I want to define my term because I don't want it to throw people off when I use the term. A myth is commonly referred to something that is a fib or a lie. We'll say, well, that's just a myth, meaning that's not true. But the truth is, that's not what a myth is. A myth is a story that is so culturally significant that you can't separate the culture from the story. And you can't separate the story from the culture. They're so intertwined that they're inseparable. And we're often not sure which created which. And it has nothing to do with whether or not it's true or not. I'll give you an example. The single most important myth in Christianity is the death and resurrection of Jesus. That story is so significant to we as Christians that if you take that story out of Christianity, all of Christianity falls apart. All of Western civilization actually begins to fall apart. But I believe with all of my heart that that story is true. But it's still a myth in the terms that we're going to use it, because it is a culturally significant story. Now, the way you can tell whether a myth is a living myth or a dead myth is this. A living myth has attached to it active ritual. And rituals are always reenactments of the myth. That's what rituals are. It's different from tradition. Rituals are reenactments of a myth. And if it has active ritual, then it's a living myth. So thinking about the death and resurrection of Jesus, does it have active ritual, reenactment of the myth? In our culture today, absolutely it does. Every single time we celebrate communion or the Eucharist, every time we take the bread and the cup, we are reenacting the death and resurrection of Jesus. Sometimes we even have passion plays where we're reenacting this great story. The death and resurrection of Jesus is a living myth. Now, if I were to ask you if the story of Zeus or the story of Apollo or the story of Odin and Thor are living myths or dead myths, you'd probably have to say they're dead myths because we don't have widespread rituals or reenactments of their stories in our culture. They're dead myths. Plus, I don't think those ones are true. But we also have national myths. For example, every July 4th, we go out as the sun goes down and we have what? Fireworks. What are we doing when we watch the fireworks besides enjoying the boom and the bang and the color of the fireworks? We're actually celebrating a ritual. We're reenacting a myth. We're reenacting the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 that brought us freedom and our independence in the United States. I absolutely believe the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 happened. And those two are central myths for us. We also have family myths too, by the way. And I'll give you a good example of one. When I was young, we had a Thanksgiving dinner. And my mom put out this beautiful spread of Thanksgiving dinner. But before she did that, she put out a paper tablecloth, a Thanksgiving decorated paper tablecloth. My sister, who was 10 at the time, thought it would be a fun idea to tear off a piece of the paper tablecloth and light that piece of paper on the little tea light in front of each plate. She started the fire and she thought, if it starts on fire, I'll just stick it in my glass of water. The problem is, when she lit the piece of paper, it started so fast that she dropped the piece of paper and the entire table caught fire. And my dad had to go get the fire extinguisher out and ruin part of our meal. And we've never forgotten this. To this day, even though my sister is well over 50, my mom will still put little tea lights out for special occasions, and she'll light every one except for the one in front of my sister. Is my sister a threat to start the table on fire? No, but it's a story that's part of who we are, and we can't separate that story from the culture and the beauty that is my family. So that's what I mean when I say myth. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the one myth, the monomyth. So Joseph Campbell, who is the protege of Carl Jung, he mapped out this one myth that many people began to discover in our stories. He actually figured out how the story works. And if you look on your screen right now, you could see a map of how it works. So you'll have a hero that begins in that hero's ordinary world. Now that hero might be anything from Cinderella, or it might even be Luke Skywalker from Star Wars. It might be the Princess and the Pea, or it could be Frodo from Lord of the Rings. But when you map the stories out, you'll discover they're all telling the same story. But you have a hero or heroine who has an ordinary world, and then something's going to call that hero to an adventure. Something's going to happen. Perhaps it's an announcement that there's going to be a ball and the prince is looking for a bride. Or perhaps it's Gandalf shows up at your house and says, there are black riders coming for you. Every story is going to throw our hero into an adventure. The hero will almost always then resist the adventure. But then the hero will run into a mentor of some sort, sometimes a supernatural mentor, someone wise, someone like, well, in Star Wars, it might be an Obi-Wan Kenobi, someone wise who will give them advice, and they will then go on this adventure. There will be a place in the story where there is no going back, this place of no return. At this point, the hero will pick up more friends, maybe pick up a Han Solo and a Princess Leia and a Chewbacca. Maybe it might pick up some other hobbits for the adventure. Might even pick up some little mice in the story of Cinderella. But the hero's going to pick up more friends and have a series of tests. And then there will be a place that Joseph Campbell calls the belly of the whale moment. Every story will have it. It will be this moment when the hero, where everything for the hero seems lost. All seems doomed. And somehow, though, they will get out of this terrible state. And then the final test will always have to be faced by the hero alone. And that might be Simba in the great American myth, The Lion King. That could be, pick any story. The hero's going to have to face the final test alone. Now, if the hero is going to die, it will happen after that test has been passed and the hero is on his way back to the ordinary world or her ordinary world. But the world will be better and changed because of what the hero has done. This is the story that we love. Every single great mythic story that we love. You can go through every single movie that is hugely popular, and you'll discover it is this story. You can go through every great mythological story, and it's this one story. There are other stories. We just don't like them as well. If you go to a school and learn how to write novels, you're going to learn how to write this story that Joseph Campbell has mapped out, called the monomyth, the one story. Because it's the only story we like. And I want us to use this as a template as we look at the Bible. Because you know what? We find this story in the Bible as well. Now, one of the most common questions asked of Joseph Campbell is essentially, why? Why do we love this one story? And here's what he said shortly before he died. He said, we find ourselves in every culture, in every era, from Gilgamesh, which is the oldest known literary work, to Star Wars, telling the same story over and over again. The question I am often asked is why? My simple but unsatisfying answer is just because. Personally, I find that answer bothersome. It seems like a cop-out answer. I prefer the answer that comes from somebody else who subscribed to this theory. That's the great C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and all of their friends who would meet together in a group called the Inklings also subscribed to this idea that there's one story that we really love. But they didn't call it the monomyth. They didn't call it the hero's journey. They called it the great story. The great story. And C.S. Lewis answers the question that Joseph Campbell was afraid to answer. Here's what he said. He said, the value of the myths, and remember that means the great stories that are connected to our culture. The value of the myths we most enjoy is they reveal the things we know about ourselves and restore those things which have been hidden by a veil of the familiar. And then he adds something. Not only is he saying here that the reason why we love this story is we recognize something in this. There's something familiar about it. And he's going to tell us, frankly, it's because it's the story we're in. It is my story. It is your story. It's the story of humanity. It's the story of every hero. It's something that some have called the great controversy. It is the great story. But then C.S. Lewis takes it a step further. Not only do we love it because it's familiar, but because there's a message in this story that is always there every single time. And I challenge you to try to find it not there. It's always there. And the point is this, that you are more than you think you are. isn't that the point of the stories that we love? Think about everything, every story you love. Think about every novel you love, every film you love, every folk story you love, every fairy tale you love, that you want to watch over and over and over again. You have a character who discovers that there's more to them than they realized, more to them than the people around them realized, more to them than was even possible to realize without this adventure. And C.S. Lewis says that's our story too, because there's more to us than we realize. That really is the point of the Bible. The point of the Bible is that we have a God who calls us son, who calls us daughter, calls us children. We are children of Almighty God. And there's more to us than we even realize. There's more to us than our family realizes, more to us than our friends realize. And that's why stories like that resonate with us, whether it's the greatest fantasy story or a Hallmark Christmas movie. They're all the same story. Now, some of you will recall the great Disney film, The Lion King. Now, the really good screenplay writers of Disney understood this principle well, that we have one story. And The Lion King may be one of our best examples that it's taken on almost a mythic status. And there's a scene, of course, where Simba is called to adventure. He ends up picking up a mentor, which turns out to be a baboon. He picks up some more friends who happen to be a pig and a meerkat. He has a series of adventures, ultimately comes to a place where he feels like there's no way out and will ultimately have to face the final test, which means he'll have to face his Uncle Scar alone. However, there's a moment, and this happens in most of our stories, where we have this almost Mount of Transfiguration moment. And in The Lion King, it's this dreamlike moment where Simba sees his father up in the sky, his father Mufasa. And if you've seen the film, do you remember what Mufasa says to him? He says, "Remember who you are." And he says it with that big, beautiful James Earl Jones voice because it's James Earl Jones. I wish I could have a James Earl Jones voice. But he says, "Remember who you are." And then he says this. He says, "You are more than you have become." I remember the first time I saw that. I saw it the weekend it came out in the theaters. You could almost hear an audible gasp at that moment. Why? Because that scene resonated with us as human beings. Because we all feel that. We all feel that we are more than we have become. And that's what the Bible's teaching us. That's part of what makes it not only genius spiritually, but it also is what makes it great literature. Now, Czeslaw Milosz, who's one of my all-time favorite poets, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He says, "We tell one story and only one because there is a sense that we are more than we are." I think C.S. Lewis would agree with him. I would agree with him. Robert Graves, the very unusual British poet, he put it this way: there are 1,000,000 stories, but one myth. And that is that we are more than the dim creatures we seem to be. This is the essence of religion as well as all literature. Every hero's story is our own. That's what attracts us to good stories, and that's what makes the Bible the sun that all literature revolves around. Absolutely. Now, one of the things I don't know if you've noticed is that life sometimes stinks. And the Bible absolutely recognizes that. And why does it stink? It's because there's a villain in our story. In all the great mythic stories, there's a hero, but there's also a villain. Ours has a villain. Here on your screen, you can see some of my favorite film villains. Everything from the big bad wolf to the wicked witch to the kid catcher in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Villains. Why? Why do all of the stories we love have a villain? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because our story has a villain. As a matter of fact, Ephesians 6 tells us that this is no afternoon athletic contest that we're in, that we'll walk away from and forget about it in a couple of hours. No, this is for keeps, a life or death fight to the finish against the devil and his angels. So be prepared. You're up against far more than you can handle on your own. Take all the help you can get, every weapon God has issued, so that when it's all over but the shouting, you'll still be on your feet. And don't forget to pray. So that's where we're going to go with this. We're going to be looking at some of the great stories in the Bible. And we're going to ask ourselves, what is it that makes these great? And one of the answers will be that it speaks to a truth that we already know is true. It speaks to a story we're in right now. We'll look at some of the poetry of the Bible. We'll look at the Psalms and ask ourselves, is it great poetry, and why does it resonate? It resonates because it's telling something about ourselves that we somehow already knew. And it helps us to move because there is more to us than we even imagine. We are more than we know. And we're absolutely more than we have become. So let's walk through this amazing book, the single greatest document on the planet, and let's relish it. Thanks for joining the class.